Hey everyone, this is Andy Hall, and with me today is Dr. David Kyle Johnson. I like punching each one of those names, if you notice that, just to add some gravitas to our conversation. Dr. David Kyle Johnson teaches over at King's College, and I'm just going to read the bio from King's College. David Kyle Johnson specializes in and has published on logic, critical thinking, metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and philosophy of science for journals such as Sophia, religious studies, Think, Philo, science, religion and culture, and SHRM. And SHRM is socio-historical examination of religion and ministry. He also teaches for the Great Courses, edits and writes regularly for the Wiley/Blackwell Philosophy and Pop Culture series, and maintains 2 blogs for Psychology Today, Plato on Pop, and A Logical Take. He is the author of The Myths That Stole Christmas and the editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Popular Culture as Philosophy. Johnson's CV, along with all of his works, are legally allowed to be shared for free and is available at academia.edu. Dr. David Kyle Johnson, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for asking, Andy.
Good. I feel it's obligatory for me to ask if you are healthy and everyone within your household is healthy.
Yeah, we're all healthy so far. Everything's good. Now, my wife's a teacher and I'm a teacher and my kid's in grade school, so all that could change in about 3 or 4 weeks. But right now, we're good.
Before we start talking about the work that you've done about face masks, what's going on with your kid? Are children going to school in the fall, which is only a short while away?
Here in Pennsylvania, Northeast Pennsylvania, that is the plan. They'll be back. The last I heard, the plan was to split and to have half of them go on Monday, Tuesday, and the other half go on Thursday, Friday. And the teachers, of course, will be there the entire time, which is going to create a giant nightmare if my 7-year-old is off school and both me and my wife are teaching. Not exactly sure what we're doing, but we'll figure that out eventually somehow. But yeah, that's the plan right now, is to do half and half, and that they'll be wearing masks in school and that kind of stuff. In Pennsylvania, there is a statewide mask mandate. So if you're out in public, you have to be wearing one, whether you're in school or at the store, whatever. So, getting a 7-year-old to wear a mask all day, good luck with that. But that's the law anyway.
Before we start talking about Brownian Motion, I always thought of small children, being a father myself. Even though my kids are older, I remember just watching them just be with other kids and just seem like this chaotic, unpredictable, incapable of being herded kind of motion between all of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's going to be really hard for them to control, right? Like I feel really sorry for my child's first grade teacher, because right, it's going to be impossible to control, and she's going to be putting herself in harm's way by doing her job, right, in a way that is not like healthcare workers are. They have, it's kind of expected for themselves in a harm way, although not to the extent that they have. I'm not trying to denigrate, like they've really put themselves on the line, right? But teachers are not. Never when you got into teaching did you think that I'd be putting my life on the line by being a teacher, right? But that's essentially what's going to be happening at this point. And how are they going to be able to get 7-year-olds to do the kind of things that they need to do to protect them, which is wear a mask, right? At least I, as a college professor, I've written a short paper that says the title is "Why Do We Have to Wear Masks in Class?" Right. And it lays out the science and explains what's going on, and it debunks the pseudoscience and that kind of stuff. And I can get my 18, 19, 20-year-old students to read that and understand it. And right. Like, and they can at least, if they have objections, I can just direct them to the paper. Right. And they can at least, but 7-year-olds can't do that. Right. They have no idea what's going on. So
the reason why you've been writing about face masks, from what I understand, you've been doing it on Psychology Today on your blog. Is it to do with the fact that you're going into schools? Your child is going into school. You're going into school. Your wife is going into school. What was really the genesis of you writing about face masks?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things. One is that it's concerning to me because keeping the pandemic under control is part of what's necessary to be able to go back to school and for me to still have a job and that kind of stuff, right? And so it's just like personally important that people do the responsible thing to try to keep the pandemic under control so that I can still have a job. So it's kind of selfish in that kind of way, right? But also one of the things that I specialize in, so it might seem odd that me as a philosopher is talking about masks. I'm not a medical expert. I'm not an immunologist. I'm not an epidemiologist, right? But one of the things I specialize in is pseudoscience, and specifically medical pseudoscience. Like I teach a course called Scientific, Pseudoscientific, and Medical Reasoning. I've taught science classes on scientific reasoning, right? I don't teach the advanced stuff about advanced physics and that kind of stuff, but I can teach you in the science department. I can teach classes on scientific reasoning, and I have in the past. And so debunking pseudoscience is something that's very much in my wheelhouse, as is explaining scientific arguments. So not doing the scientific research myself, but looking at the scientific research, seeing what it says and seeing what the scientific argument is and being able to articulate what that argument, the scientific argument is, right? And then debunking the pseudoscientific arguments against it, right? And so that's where my expertise are. That I am an expert in. Explaining the science and debunking pseudoscience, that is what I'm an expert in. And so that's what I've tried to bring my expertise. That's why I've tried to bring my expertise to this issue, because not only is it kind of personally important for me, because I think it's important to, keep the pandemic down so I can still have my job, but it's just in general, it's important because it saves lives, right? And it's kind of a thorny issue. It's easily confusing. The mask issue is easily confusing. And so it is, I think it's important to try to clarify that.
Sure. I want to say hello to Joan out there in the chat. Dr. Johnson, what are some common factors in everyday pseudoscience that you see manifesting in the mask debate right now?
Well, a lot of it, pseudoscientists revel in misinformation and misleading information and trying to, that's where the term comes from, pseudoscience, right? It kind of looks like science, but it's not really. And so what they will do is give you something that kind of looks scientific, and it might be a scientific study and that kind of stuff that kind of looks on face to support their point. But then when you look at it deeper, it doesn't actually do that. So for example, a really good example of this is the way that mask use, and specifically widespread mask use, helps curb the spread of COVID in particular, is not by protecting the person who wears it. So this is a very common misconception that, like, the reason why they're making us all wear masks is so that we're each protecting ourselves. And so the government's making you protect yourself from COVID to make sure that you don't get it. And that's how we're going to mitigate the spread. And that is not what mask use is for in this kind of pandemic. And it's a good thing because masks actually aren't that good at protecting their wearer. To protect their wearer, they have to filter the ambient air, like as you're breathing it in. And that's not as direct. When you're breathing in, it's not as directed. You're not pushing it straight out. So it can kind of seep through the sides and that kind of stuff. And then the aerosols in the outside air are a lot smaller than what you're breathing out of your mouth. And so it's not as easily caught. It can, don't get me wrong, they can offer some protection to the wearer, but it's not ideal. It's like 50% or something like that. It's not wonderful. Right.
Right.
But that's not, and that's why if you get if you get surgical masks online or whatever, and they come with a warning that says these are not tested or intended to protect the wearer from infection. They're not. But that's not what we're using them for in terms of preventing the spread. What we're using them for to prevent the spread is not to protect the wearer, but to protect other people from the wearer in case they have it. Mm-hmm. So in other words, when an infected person is wearing a mask, right? The infected person has got the virus in their mouth, right, in their lungs and in their system, right? And as they talk, right, droplets and aerosols come out of their mouth, even as they breathe, right? And so aerosols or droplets are just really small. And so let me give a little definition. You've got like bigger particles, like droplets that are just pieces of liquid that are filled with the virus, and they're heavy enough to drop to the ground, okay? On the other extreme side, you have little teeny, like I won't say microscopic, but very small, like 10 micron, 1 micron droplets that are so light that when they go out of your mouth, they don't drop. They just float in the air, right? And then I think the nastiest little boogers. Now, the thing is, with those aerosols, you don't have to worry about, you have to worry about them, yes and no. No, in that like only 1 out of every 700 of those aerosols will have a virus in it, like from an infected person. 1 out of 700 of the aerosols that come out of an infected person's mouth will have a virus in it, right? Other 699 don't, right? But there's a lot of them, even though most of the material that's coming out of your mouth is not aerosols. Most of the material is the droplets, right? The bigger stuff that's got most of the viral load. Most of the viral load is that, and that's caught by the mask. But those aerosols do hang in the air longer, right? So even though they only have one virus in them, they can hang around and they might be able to come out and find you from way greater than 6 feet, right? It's not clear whether one virus is enough to infect you, and most likely degree of exposure will dictate how severe your symptoms are. So if you're only getting exposed to like one virus, it's probably not a big deal. The worst little buggers are the droplets that are in between the bigger ones and the aerosols. They start out a little bit bigger, like 100 microns, let's say. And so they can have more virus in them, but they're not heavy enough to drop all the way to the ground before they evaporate, and they can become smaller and be aerosolized. And they have a lot more viruses in them, right? And this is what's so great about masks, is that they can catch the aerosols. And we'll talk about how they can even catch aerosols in a minute when we talk about Brownian motion and that kind of stuff. But the bigger particles, the really big ones, and then even like the 100 micron, the ones that would evaporate and become airborne aerosols that are really potent, the mask catches those because they're big when they come out of your mouth, right? They only get smaller after they leave your mouth. And so the mask can catch those at a much higher rate, not a much higher rate, but at a higher rate than they can catch aerosols. And that's really, really important to catch those particular ones because they can float around and have higher viral loads. So all that said, right, the purpose of masks in this context to prevent the spread of COVID is to filter exhaled air, not inhaled air, to protect other people from the wearer, not protect the wearer. So what pseudoscientists will do, now that's confusing. It took me a while to explain that, right?
Right.
What pseudoscientists will do is cite studies about how well masks protect their wearer, right? And like studies show, and this is not surprising, given what surgical masks and that kind of stuff do, they are not sufficient for healthcare workers in high-risk environments. Right? Like, of course they're not, because the viruses and that kind of stuff are everywhere. They're in the air, they're on surfaces, they're everywhere, right? And a regular surgical mask is not going to be sufficient to protect a healthcare worker if they're going into a room with a COVID patient, right? Yeah. They need those N95 respirators, right? But what the pseudoscientists will do is cite a study that shows that cloth masks or surgical masks are not sufficient to protect healthcare workers in high-risk environments and say, see, they don't work. Right. It's like, no, that is completely irrelevant. That's not how they're supposed to work for what we're wanting them to do. Right. That doesn't show at all that they can't filter exhalations. All those show is that they can't sufficiently filter inhalations in high-risk environments for healthcare workers. Right. But it sounds really convincing to find this article that says, oh, well, they don't protect healthcare workers, so why would they protect you? They're not protecting me, they're protecting other people. Sure. Right. But that's a really slick kind of pseudoscientific move that people will do.
Right. They're cherry picking their data. They're cherry picking the articles, the studies that they're drawing from. So let me ask you, how clear is the scientific consensus on the fact that masks do help control the spread of COVID-19?
Yeah, as far as I know, all the research I've looked at it, there is unanimous consensus on this. And it's kind of interesting how it happened. It happened very, very quickly because as I understand it, the way it went was this. The way that we really looked at, like the CDC and the WHO and that kind of stuff kind of looked at masks was in terms of protecting the wearer. And since we've known for a long time that they don't protect the wearer all that well, especially in high-risk environments, right? The CDC and that kind of stuff did not recommend mask use for healthy people in pandemics and that kind of stuff because they didn't think they provided sufficient protection to the wearer, right? And so that's why for a long time they didn't give those kinds of recommendations, right? And then two things happened. One is people started talking about not their ability to protect the wearer, but protect other people from the wearer, not to filter inhalations, but exhalations, and to think of them in those terms. And secondly, we realized how long and how common it is for someone to be infected with COVID and not know it, and be infectious and not know it, right? So like if you're if you have a disease like the flu, where you start showing symptoms like, a day or two, or something, like usually a day or two or something like that after you contract it, right? Then you can say, well, if you contract it, then just stay home, right? If you're sick and you have to go out, put a mask on so you protect other people, right? But other than that, if you're healthy, you don't really have to worry about it, because if you're healthy, like you don't have any symptoms, you likely don't have it. So you're not going to be spreading it to other people, and it's not going to protect you that much. And so it's not going to really do any good. So there wouldn't be any reason to wear it if you're healthy, right?
Right.
But once you realize you have a disease where people can be infected for 2 damn weeks without knowing it, right? And they could be spreading the virus to other people, you realize, well, we do need to wear it, because there's going to be a bunch of people out there that are infected and don't realize it, right? They think they're healthy, but they're not. And so it makes sense to ask them, and so the only way to do that, since we don't have universal testing or anything like that. Like if we had universal testing, we wouldn't need masks. We could just tell who had it and who didn't, and whoever has it would have to wear the mask. But without the universal testing, the only way to make sure that everyone who is infected is wearing a mask and not passing on to others is just to say everybody's got to wear one.
Yeah.
Right. So once we started kind of shifted our thinking in terms of what masks do, instead of protecting the wearer, but protecting others, and add to that the fact that we realized how common it is for people to have COVID but not realize it, the universal mask mandate made sense. And all the scientific community went, oh, yeah, okay, yes, that makes sense. And then since then, there's been a number of studies to show that masks actually do exactly what they need to do to stop the spread of COVID. There's been tests where they actually test their abilities to drop particles and aerosols. And if you make them right, like surgical masks can do this, multi-layered cloth masks can do this. They filter, like if you're going 10 micron and up, it's like, 5 micron and up, it's 90% effective, and 5 micron and below, it's 80% effective, right? And it doesn't have to be 100% effective to reduce the spread of COVID.
Yeah.
Right. So this is another kind of pseudoscientific argument that people will give is, well, they can't protect you 100%. Right. If just one aerosol gets through, one infected aerosol gets through, you'll get infected. It's not likely that's true. One aerosol is not going to be enough. And again, only 1 out of 700 are infected anyway. Right. But they don't have to. All they have to do to reduce the spread is reduce the number of infected particles in the environment, right? In the air and on surfaces and that kind of stuff, right? And the mask will definitely do that. Will they eliminate it? No, they won't eliminate it, but they'll greatly reduce the number of infected particles in the environment, and that greatly reduces the chances for everyone else of becoming infected, right? Yeah, won't guarantee it, right? And the analogy I like to draw with this, and this analogy works really well, is bulletproof vests.
Yeah.
Right? Bulletproof vests do not offer 100% protection. They protect your torso. Your head's still exposed, your arms are still exposed, your legs still exposed, right? A bullet can still get through. Armor-piercing bullets can still get through.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they don't offer protection. They make the bulletproof vests make you safer. It's the same thing with masks, right? They don't block it all. Of course they don't. Nothing could. Not even N95 masks can block it all, right? But they can block a lot of it. That greatly reduces the amount in the environment, and that offers protection for everyone. That reduces everyone's exposure, and thus reduces everyone's probability of getting it.
Right. We have a question from the chat from Tons of Mice. Did we learn anything useful for the 1918 pandemic? What advice might we give regarding future pandemickers or people in future pandemics?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the 2000 or on the 1918 pandemic. I know that there was like anti-mask movements and that kind of stuff in that pandemic as well, right? It is since that was the flu, and the COVID is definitely different than flu. It's a lot more similar to SARS than flu. I'm not sure how the analogies can be drawn across from the 1918 pandemic, other than like maybe the biggest one is we got to watch out for that second wave, right? That second wave that hit in the fall, that could definitely happen to us. And that's even more reason to wear masks, right? So one of the things I've learned researching this is that one hypothesis for why like the flu spreads more in the winter is decreased humidity. Yeah. And essentially the decreased humidity makes the aerosols. Well, there's a couple actually different things. Maybe the increase in humidity kills the virus. That's one hypothesis. Another one is the decreased humidity makes more particles aerosolized, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not exactly clear which one is the right hypothesis. I've seen the authors that write on this think it's the first one, that the humidity kills the virus, but regardless, right? Other experts who write on this and talk about environment and its effect on pandemics say that when you're in a pandemic like this, humidity has very little to do with how it spreads. It's mostly who's immune, who's not, who's vulnerable, who's not, and humidity has very little to do with it. And the fact that it spread like wildfire in July in Texas and Florida is pretty good indication that that's right, that humidity has very little to do with it, right? But if by the time we get to December or the next year or whatever, right, and it does, like once it's kind of taken hold and it does, like you got to really worry about this winter or next winter about how bad it could be, right? But that's all the more reason. Like some pseudoscientists will say, oh, it's the humidity that causes it, so masks can't do anything. No, the humidity is a factor, right? But that's not the only causal factor. Exposure is another causal factor, obviously. And if you can limit exposure by wearing the mask, then you're going to reduce the spread, right? You can't keep there from being a peak. If the humidity causes a peak, there'll still be a hump or whatever, but you can bring that down with mask use, right? Sure. But that's like, so the humidity thing is not a reason to not wear masks. It's actually more reason to wear a mask because it's still humid.
Right.
And so when the winter hits, it could be a lot worse.
There was this pivot about masks. A lot of people feel that science betrayed them almost, with the idea that we're not supposed to wear masks. Now we are supposed to wear masks. Yeah. What are they going to say? What are they are going to say in another 3 months? Oh, you never had to wear masks to begin with. Is this just an effect of poor science education here in the States, that people don't understand the conditional nature of truth, basically, in science?
Yeah, that's part of it, right? Like, it's just people don't understand that good scientists update their beliefs with new information, right? And that's exactly what happened. And I'll be honest, I think the CDC and the WHO were too slow to update. That the experts were already saying, yeah, we need to be wearing masks, but the CDC, because the CDC and WHO are scientific organizations, but they're also political organizations in a kind of way. Yeah. And they do kind of have a status quo bias where they kind of drag behind, and it takes a lot of evidence before they finally change their recommendation. And so I think they kind of drug behind a little bit on this, right? But again, like, because we hadn't really dealt with the pandemic like this for so long, the science was not on top of things. Like, we didn't have all the 6 foot rule about keeping your distance from 6 foot is based on studies from like the 30s and the 40s. And I've actually seen some decent research that suggests that they're probably not that great of studies, and it probably needs to be more than 6 foot. In other words, the physical droplets that are leaving your mouth, not just the aerosols, but the droplets that are leaving your mouth, could probably go farther than 6 feet. And so 6 feet may not be enough, right?
I just want to go over that point again for people in the audience. The studies that say 6 feet is relatively a good distance from the 1930s and the 1940s.
Yeah. So if you're interested in this, look at my, let me remind myself which one it's on. Let me look. I've got it. Well, I'll give you some links to some papers of mine on like masks work and that kind of stuff. And you should be able to find that information there. There's a couple of scientists that were just talking about that just happens. Like it's a lot more common, I think, in the medical field than others, where you just kind of get like what we've been taught is what's right. And sometimes doctors and medical professionals are a little bit slower to update their beliefs based on the evidence. Right. And just because of and part of the reason is because there's so much damn pseudoscience out there that you just get this automatic, like, yeah, somebody said that's probably bunk. Right. And like 9 times out of 10 or 99 out of times out of 100, you're probably going to be right. But then there's these occasions where we do actually need to update our beliefs because it's based on old information. Right. And it might be even the 20s. I'm not exactly sure the decade. I'm kind of going off my memory here. I'd have to look up. But they are old studies. Like Google, where did the 6 foot rule come from, or something like that, and that might make an article pop up about it where they mention these studies and that kind of stuff. And so, but I think it is due to people just not understanding that scientists can change their mind based on evidence, right? And that's what they should do, right? And that's why I kind of tried early on, I tried to articulate what the process was, right? The reason we changed our mind on this is because we were thinking about it in a different way. We were thinking in terms of mask protecting the wearer, and we were thinking in terms of a disease like the flu that usually shows symptoms within 2 or 3 days, right?
Yep.
And I'm kind of roughshotting the 2 or 3 days, but it shows symptoms a lot earlier, right?
Sure.
And then we start thinking in terms of masks protecting other people from the wearer, and we realize that COVID can go for 14 days without showing symptoms, and we say, oh, that's very different information that we now know, and that's going to change the recommendation. Right?
Yeah, right. I got to ask you a question. Face shields, do they do anything? I mean, I imagine they stop droplets, don't they?
They should stop droplets. They would stop droplets. So let me say a couple things. We don't, as far as I've been able to tell, we don't have good tests on the face shields yet. All right. We've got really good tests on the masks. Not only do we have tests on the masks that show how many particles they can filter out. There's also in one of my documents, the Why Do Masks Work document, I believe, I cite a study by Lauren, I believe. I may be misremembering the last name there, where she actually did a randomized controlled trial where they took people who were infected, put them in a room, had some wear masks, had others would not wear masks, and then they tested the air, right? They tested the aerosols and the droplets and stuff that they found in the air for viral load. And the viral load in the rooms where the people were wearing masks was way lower than the viral load where they weren't wearing a mask, right? That's all the mask needs to do is lower the viral load in the air to reduce the spread, right? And so we've got those kinds of studies with masks. We don't have those kinds of studies with face shields. And so I can't talk to their efficacy in that way. Now, just naturally, physically, they must stop droplets. Like when they're coming out of your mouth, they're going to stop droplets. Some might be dropping down, but they're going to stop droplets. But here's they won't stop aerosols. Yeah. Right? Because the aerosol, now they will catch those bigger droplets that are coming out of your mouth that would aerosolize. Yeah. They won't do that, right? But they're not going to catch the ones that start out as aerosols at all, right? Your mask will do that. They'll catch about 80% of those aerosols, right? The face mask won't. And that's significant because we don't know exactly what the main mechanism of transference or for infection, right, is for COVID. It's the CDC and WHO says it's primarily droplets. Yeah. Right. But there was this big letter by a bunch of real scientists, not pseudoscientists, real scientists that said, we don't know it's not aerosols, and we don't know actually how much aerosol transmission is active here. We cannot dismiss that possibility. It needs further study. We need to look at whether it's aerosols, right? And so the CDC and the WHO now say, right, it seems to be primarily droplets, but it could also be aerosols. We need more study on this issue. And there are some interesting studies out there that suggest that they're case studies. They're not like randomized controlled trials or whatever, but they're case studies that seem to indicate that like there was infection that happened that maybe was most likely aerosol, like because it happened at a long distance. And that would be more likely to be aerosols. Now, because the 6-foot rule about droplets is a little outdated, it could possibly be droplets too, right? But because we don't know that it's not aerosols, right? And we know that face masks are not going to be catching those aerosols, the tiniest ones. Right? Again, they'll be catching the bigger ones that splat on your face mask that could evaporate and become aerosols, right? But they won't be catching any of those aerosols that come right out of your mouth. The masks do. Yes. The masks do catch those, right? Now, not all of them and not as many as the bigger particles, but they do catch them. And because of that, the mask is necessarily going to be better than the face shield.
Should I panic in elevators?
I am not going to be riding in any elevators.
Oh, okay.
Especially if they can be crowded, right? Yeah. I think that our campus is probably going to have a rule where like 2 people to an elevator at a time. And so then you shouldn't panic very much because it's just about whether the other person, well, I guess it's not even that, because if someone else had it that was just in there before you, and it's aerosolized, right? And it's in the aerosols, then you might have to worry about the other people who were in there before you as well. That's one of the things, because we don't know whether it's droplets or aerosols, right? Again, it's not, it is droplets. We know that droplets can transmit it, right? It might be aerosols too, and we don't know to what degree it is aerosols, right? And because of that, you have to worry about being in enclosed spaces. Even if you're 6 feet away from people, you have to worry about being in enclosed spaces with people, right? Where the air is not filtered and circulated well and that kind of stuff, right? And so I'm not going to be in any elevators. I'll be taking the stairs when I have to, and only when I have to.
Because it's funny how the human brain works, right? I hadn't even thought about it until I walked into my building maybe about 2 weeks ago, and I got into the elevator. There was no one else in the elevator, but it's a small elevator, Doctor. Yeah. And all of a sudden the doors close, and I'm like, oh, I'm in a horror movie, and this is how this ends, or this is the beginning of the end right here.
Well, not to freak you out or whatever, but there was, and again, it's just a case study, but there was a study of someone who came back from overseas. And because they came back, they were supposed to quarantine, and they did, right? But they had to get from the airport to their apartment. And to get from the airport to their apartment, they took the elevator in their apartment complex up to their elevator, and they were alone in the elevator. And there was a massive breakout, because what happened is, after they took that elevator, someone else in the apartment building, a child, took that elevator too, ended up infecting her dad, I believe. Her dad ended up in the hospital, infecting a whole bunch of other people, yada, yada, yada. And it was all because they had just took the same elevator, right? So it is, again, with aerosols or droplets, I don't know, right? Maybe her hands were dirty and she hit the button and the kid hit the button. Or maybe she breathed out in it, and then the other kid took it after she took it, and the aerosols was through it. I don't know, right? But it's definitely possible to catch it from, it's at least possible to catch it from someone that just because they rode the elevator before you, not even at the same time.
I've become adept that when I have taken elevators to push the buttons with my knee. I just raise my knee up, and I do sometimes I do the elbow. Sometimes when I'm feeling adventurous, I just lift up a knee and hit that button, because the less contact I have, I feel is better. Is that a basic strategy that I should be doing?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I use my keys. Right?
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Right. Sometimes they actually make little metal things that you can keep on your key ring that you can wrap around your finger, and it's just like a little finger that pushes buttons for you for this very purpose. Yeah. I mean, in that way, you don't have to worry about it being on. You still wash your hands and that kind of stuff as often as you can. But yeah, I mean, that's totally reasonable. You keep it off your fingertips so you keep it from getting everywhere else. Right. Yeah. So another pseudoscientific thing to look out for, it's just something I wanted to mention.
Oh, yeah.
So we talked about how they would talk about studies that are about like masks' ability to protect their wearer as evidence that they can't protect others. And obviously that's irrelevant, right? That would be like saying that here's a study that shows that bulletproof vests don't work because they don't act as flotation devices. Right? Like, no, that's a different topic. That's about a different function that they have, right? Or have or wouldn't have, right? But another thing that is very common. So let me spell out give you a really quick analogy about this, right? Let's use the bulletproof vest analogy. If I wanted to teach you, if I wanted to prove to you that bulletproof vests work, and by work I mean they protect their wearer, right, from bullets. What I would do is I would explain to you the physics of how Kevlar works. Right, I could do the basics about how they block bullets and how the bullets can't go through them usually, and right. I would do some lab tests, right, to put up some dummies and put some bulletproof vests on some and not others, and shot at them, and I would show you how the dummies fared after being shot at with or without the vest, right. And then I would show you studies, right, like where like correlational studies that show here was the platoon and here was their injury and death rate, and then they started wearing vests, and their death rate and injuries declined. Right. And I would show you different, platoons. Here's where they started using vests and it went down. Right. That would be enough. That would be enough to prove to you that bulletproof vests work. You don't need a randomized controlled trial on bulletproof vests to know that they work, that you understand the physics. You've got some lab work. You've got some correlational studies. That's good enough. And in fact, any randomized controlled trial you did to try to prove that vests work would actually be pretty useless.
Yes.
Because the only way to actually do a true, real randomized controlled trial that shows that they actually protect human life would be to take 1,000 people, give 500 of them vests at random, and then put on a blindfold and just start shooting.
Yeah.
That's the only way to, right? But obviously, ethically, we can't do that, right? So the only other kinds of randomized controlled trials that can be done on these kinds of things are with people who are using vests already in the field.
Yeah.
Right, like in the real world, you'd look at soldiers who are wearing them, soldiers who aren't, and you would compare the differences in the two groups, right? But here's the problem: those studies aren't truly controlled because they're out in the real world, and the real world is chaotic and random, and all kinds of weird stuff can happen, right? And so if you ever, because of that randomness, because of that chaotic nature of the real world, if you ever showed me a study where we compared, this soldier group, this platoon that wore vests and this one that didn't, and they said, we found no difference between the two, I would not say, oh, well, I'm going to conclude that vests don't work. They must offer no protection at all, right? I would say, oh, well, there must have been some kind of random variable that threw off that study. Mm-hmm. Right? Like that's not going to, if it showed that there was a difference, then I'd say, okay, that told me it'd be pretty useless because it would tell me what I already know. Right? But if it showed no difference, I'd say that's useless too, because obviously the best explanation for why you can't find a difference is that there was randomness in the real world that threw off that trial. Yeah. Right? So so this is what's happening. Okay. Let me finish the analogy. If someone had a vendetta against Kevlar, let's say they had some kind of alternate thing or whatever their vendetta is, right? If they went to that randomized controlled trial, right, and they quote the line from the study that says, we can find no difference between the two groups. And that's all they do, right? There's this study by so-and-so, and they quote that line from the study. And then they say, see, they don't work. They don't work at all. Yeah. See, there's a randomized controlled trial, and randomized controlled trials are the golden standard of science. And so this shows that they don't work. So all your observational and your correlational stuff, that's all junk because I have a randomized controlled trial that shows they don't work, right? No. That randomized controlled trial is not nearly as powerful as good as you think it is, right? It does not tell you what you think it does. And what's really telling is that they'll quote that line, right? But they'll leave out the part where the authors say, but this study was limited. It was in the real world. We were unable to fully control it. Maybe there's a line in there, like there are about a lot of mask studies. There'd be a line in there about, and consistent vest use was not constant. Right in the vest wearing group, right? So this really tells us nothing about the whether they offer protection at all, and so really we can't conclude anything from this, right? If your person who's against it is quoting that line about not finding a difference between the two studies, but leaving out all the parts where about how limited the study was, and this can't actually show us anything, they're trying to fool you, right? They're trying to make it seem like that study shows what that study doesn't actually show. The quote is accurate, but the quote is quote mined to make it look like the study shows something that it doesn't show. Right. This is what's going on in the mask debate. You'll find some articles of people like, look at all these studies that show that masks don't work. Most of them are about whether they protect healthcare workers, and that's irrelevant for the reasons I've already stipulated, right? But even the ones that are about source control, that are about whether they can protect other people from the wearer, they're always limited. The groups are small and that kind of stuff. And when they quote them, they only quote that line about the not finding a difference in the result, right? And they skip the part where the author says, not being able to find a difference doesn't mean there's not a difference. That's how all randomized controlled trials work. It just means we were only able to find the effect. Doesn't mean the effect is there. The study was limited, blah, 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 blah. And they're leaving all of that stuff out to fool you, to make it seem like the science is settled and blah, blah, blah. Randomized controlled trials are not the golden standard for all science. They're definitely necessary for drugs, for treatments, for vaccines. We need that stuff. That randomized controlled trials, that's what we need it for. And we can ethically do those kinds of tests. We can't do that with masks. The analogous test for masks would be to take infected people, put them in a room, take 1,000 people, give 500 of them masks at random, and then throw them blindly into those rooms with infected people. You can't do that ethically, right? All you can do is these real world trials, and they'll always be limited, far from the golden standard, right? But that's the kind of moves that are being made in the pseudoscience world. And again, it looks like science. It looks really pretty when you look at it. It looks like science, but that's why it's called pseudoscience.
Exactly. What I find interesting about the Kevlar and the cloth face masks, analogy, is that from what I understand about Kevlar, it's multiple layers, and those layers help distribute the force of the incoming projectile. It's somewhat similar, at least in my mind, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, about the multiple layers in a cloth face mask that can that can trap these particles.
Yeah.
Because,
So I see what you're saying. I'd have to look more into Kevlar specifically about how it works, but there might be something because the reason that a mask works the way it does is, I'll go over this really quickly, right? There's kind of three kinds of particles that you're trying to catch. There's the big ones, the mediums ones, and to be simple, the small ones, right? Actually, there's kind of four. There's the big, the medium, the small, and the super small. We'll get to the super small in a minute, right? The big ones they catch by what's called, I think it's just called impaction, right? It just hits the outside of the mask. They're just too big to even try to go through it, right? The medium-sized ones so the mask, if they're made right? So surgical mask and multi-layered cloth masks, they're not porous. They're not woven together like this where they have holes in them, right? They're non-woven material that creates, it's a very complex kind of weave is not the right word because they're not woven, but a complex kind of compression of materials where they're all kind of pushed in together. And basically what it does is create a little maze that the particle would have to get through the mask.
Right.
And because that maze is so complicated, if the particle's small enough to fit through like the first layer of the mask, like there's a little space in the first layer of the mask. If it's small enough to fit through that, okay, but then it's got to weave its way through this complicated maze in the material to get all the way through to the other side. And it's hard, like the bigger the particle is, the harder it is for it to do that. And usually it just ends up getting smacked up against one of the fibers in the mask, and the droplet adheres to it, and whatever virus it's carrying adheres to it. Right? The viruses don't travel on their own. They always travel in droplets. All right. So the third category, let's go to the third category, and then I'll make a little distinction on the fourth category. The third category is the super, super, super small ones, the ones that are below 0.3 microns. Right. And you might think, well, those are so small, it'd be impossible for a mask to catch them. And it actually turns out that they're easier to catch. And the reason why is because of something called Brownian motion. If you have something that's that small, 0.3 microns or lower than 0.3 microns, it's so small, it's so light that not only does gravity really not affect it, but the molecules of like oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen, that kind of stuff that are in the air, they affect it. And so as those gaseous particles bounce around, they take that little tiny droplet and they just flip it all over the place. And it just, right? So it moves in this really, really chaotic way. Right? It's super small, but it's super, super chaotic motion, right? Yep. And so as that particle comes up against the mask, right, it would still have to go through the maze, right? But because as it goes through the maze, it's having, it's having a fit, right? It's very likely to run up against something in the mask. So it actually turns out that the smallest particles, 0.3 microns and lower, are actually easier to catch. The ones that are the hardest to catch are right at like 0.3. Because they're not dominated by Brownian motion at that point. So they don't wiggle around like crazy, but they're kind of like as small as you could possibly get without wiggling around. And so those are the ones that are hardest to catch. N95 respirators are called N95 respirators because they've been tested to catch 95% of those particles.
Okay. Wow.
They catch more than particles smaller and larger than that. But the hardest to capture particles, those 0.3 micron particles, they're 95% efficient at catching those. Right. The virus itself is like 0.12 microns. It's smaller than that. So if it was actually traveling by itself, you wouldn't have to worry as much as if it was in a droplet because it's subject to it's dominated by Brownian motion, and so so it will move chaotically and it'd be easier for a mask to actually catch it.
Right. Right.
But they don't travel by themselves anyway. They travel in droplets or the aerosols. But again, aerosols are just tiny droplets.
Right. So Edward from the chat is asking basically how fast is Brownian motion? It isn't faster than light, is it, Doctor? I wouldn't imagine it.
No, of course not. Nothing can be faster than light. Nothing can accelerate faster than light, except maybe on certain interpretations of quantum mechanics. But no, it's not faster than light. And it's not actually due. So a lot of people think, because there's randomness on the quantum scale, some people think that the Brownian motion is quantum, and it's not. It's just a result of the gases, right? The particles of gas, because they're spread out, they're gases, they're not bound to each other. They just bounce around chaotically, right? And so it's just like it's all that gas that's in there, right? And it's just a little bit big. The particle's a little bit bigger than the gases, but it's so light it's not affected by gravity. And so it's just all that chaotic gas motion that's just kind of bouncing them around. And that's what, right. But that's the nice thing about masks is that, and so let me make this point. Because the gases are smaller than the particles, right? Because we're talking about molecules of oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? The virus is made up of more than that, right? Like it's a lot with the virus, and then a droplet that contains a virus is made up a whole lot more than that. You know, it's a lot bigger than the gaseous particles, right? The gaseous particles are so small. When you breathe in, those gaseous particles can make their way through that maze and get into your lungs, right? And when you exhale, so when you exhale when you inhale the oxygen can get through. When you exhale the carbon dioxide will get through, right? This is the brilliant thing about masks. That's why they're filters. They trap the bigger stuff you don't want to get through, but they don't trap the oxygen and the carbon dioxide so that you can still breathe. And this is why people can put on pulse ox and put on 5 masks and breathe for 5 minutes and their oxygen's not affected, right? And notice, so there's a lot of people who say that masks are dangerous because they suffocate you or they'll lead to carbon dioxide poisoning, right? So they can't let oxygen in and they can't let that carbon dioxide out, right? But these are the same people who say that masks don't work, that they don't block the aerosols and they don't block, right? Notice the complete hypocrisy here, right? Either masks are so porous that they just let all the droplets and aerosols out everywhere and they don't work at all, right? And if they do that, there's no way in hell they can block oxygen and carbon dioxide from getting in and out of your mouth, right? Or they are so non-porous and work so well that they won't even let carbon dioxide or oxygen in. Well, if that's the case, they will definitely guarantee this, the prevent the spread of COVID, because there's no way that particles and aerosols are going to get out of there. If it's so fine it's blocking gas, there's no way it's going to block liquid, right? And so it's this complete hypocritical, like they don't work at all, but they also suffocate you. That's not possible.
That's not possible. No.
What is possible is that they can block particles like droplets. They can block liquids, but not gases. That is possible. You can design them to be in that sweet spot where they can do one and not the other. And that's what they do.
Sure. So tell me how stupid I am. I like playing this game.
I'm going to tell you you're stupid.
My girlfriend and I are renting out a movie theater. It's a small independent movie theater here in Cambridge, right in Harvard Square. We're only having about 5 people join us. We're seeing this as the last real outdoor fun thing before, flu season starts up. We've been very conservative about going out. Like I said, 5 people for the whole theater. There's 2 levels to the theater. Everyone has to wear a mask as long as they're not eating and drinking. And like I said, there's only going to be 5 of us. On a scale of 1 to stupid, which I guess is 10, is this a bad idea, Doctor?
Okay, let me ask you a couple questions about it. Your friends are going to have they been anywhere? Or have they been quarantining and being careful as well?
Yes, they have been. They've been prudent.
Okay, all right. That'd be the biggest worry if somebody just came back from somewhere or traveled anywhere in the country or down south or something like that, and then they're coming back. But if they've been safe and quarantining in their house and that kind of stuff, and their own exposure has been like going to the grocery store and that kind of stuff, right? I don't think that you're too bad. It is indoor. If you could do this outdoor instead of indoor, it would be better. Like if you could set up an outdoor theater behind your house or something like that and do that instead of being in an enclosed space, that would be better on the condition, like in case it's aerosols. Right. Because if it's aerosols, the 6 feet and that kind of stuff is not going to help you. I will say that if you're saying you got to wear a mask unless you're eating, you probably just you're going to reduce because when they got the mask off, they're going to be putting the aerosols out and that kind of stuff in the air, right? If they put it on while they're not eating, they will reduce the total number of aerosols and that kind of stuff and droplets and stuff that they're putting out in the air. But really, you're not. I mean, it's kind of like wearing your mask under your nose. You're not really doing anybody any good because it's all coming out there. You're doing a little good because you're stopping some of the droplets that are coming out here, right? But it's like half of it's coming out here. Same kind of thing, right? Like you really should just say you got to wear your mask the whole time, and there's not going to be any eating and drinking. That would be safer. But the better angle would be to do it outside if you can.
Sure. I understand. So that's something for me to think about, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, again, if they've been being careful, as people you know well, they haven't shown any symptoms. I mean, as long as they're all healthy, you're fine. There'd just be the risk of one of them has it and doesn't know it, right?
Right.
But yep.
So Tons of Mice wants to know what I'm going to be watching. We're going to be doing a Buster Keaton double feature. Both movies are under an hour, so we'll be out of there probably like an hour and 45 minutes or so. We get in there, both movies play back to back. We'll be out in under 2 hours, I imagine.
Yep. I mean, that won't protect you. The time frame there, 2 hours is plenty to get infected.
2 hours is plenty to die. I think we're gonna put that down.
2 hours is plenty to get infected. It's 2 hours is plenty to get infected. So
if James Bond was going to do a movie about COVID-19, it might be called 2 hours is plenty time to die. Very good. So
that's the thing too with COVID is the mortality rate, especially as we kind of learn more about it, the mortality rate among infections has dropped because we've got better at treating it and that kind of stuff, right? But then as we're doing that, we're also seeing like even if you survive, you can have, because it looks like it affects in a way that flu doesn't. It affects your blood vessels and your arteries and that kind of stuff. And you could have tissue damage, organ damage. There's other kind of stuff that can come out of it, even if you do survive. So you may be suffering for the rest of your life, even if you survive it, right? And so that makes it even more risky. But
sure. Epileptic Skeptic from the chat. What's your advice for people living in Florida right now? Florida seems to be pretty hard hit.
Yeah. Besides move from Florida, the advice would be shelter in place as much as you can. Wear your mask for the protection of others whenever you go out. And just be very careful about not touching your face and that kind of stuff whenever you go out. And like if you go to the grocery store or whatever, right, when you touch stuff, be very cognizant not to touch your face or to touch that kind of stuff. It looks like that object spread is not that common. It doesn't look like right, like you don't have to worry about disinfecting your groceries and that kind of stuff when you come home as much as we originally thought, which is good. That's science updating our beliefs based on the new information or whatever. But like while you're out there, right, like it is definitely possible if someone was just there and at you and then you grab it and do this number, right, like you could get infected that way. And so be careful, not to do that. Now, if you have to go to work and that kind of stuff, like, I mean, again, your mask can't protect you that much. It's protecting other people. So what you can do is encourage other people to wear their masks, right? If you have to work, talk to your employer about having a mask mandate at your, at your work. I think I'm right in assuming it's not mandatory in Florida yet. They don't have a statewide mask mandate. But if your employer can be persuaded, I'll give Andy some links of some of my stuff. I actually have a little article I wrote on why we have to wear masks in class that I'm going to have my students read on the first day. And you could use that for like to convince your employer that they need to have a mask mandate. You could maybe, have them read that. And it kind of lays out the science of why they work, debunk some of the pseudoscience, scientific arguments that they don't, that kind of stuff. And maybe that would be helpful. But long and short of it is you got to be as careful as you can in these trying times. I'm going to start teaching class in about 2-3 weeks. And I'm going to have them read that paper and they're supposed to be wearing masks. That's mandated. If they're not, I'm going to kick them out of class. Like they're supposed to protect me, I'm supposed to protect them. And I'm not going to be riding out the elevator. I'm not going to be taking the stairs. I'm not even planning to go to my office. I'm going to go in and teach, come right home and do office hours and stuff from my computer right here via Zoom and stuff. And I'm going to go in and teach, come home. I'm not even going to go into my office because I'd have to take the elevator and stairs to get there. And I'd be inside with a whole bunch of other people and that kind of stuff. And that's just raises the risk unnecessarily.
Well, before we went live, we were talking about the economics of colleges and universities. You want to talk a little bit about that in this age of COVID?
Yeah. So like, again, this is not my area of expertise, but what I'm worried about is, so public schools can go online, and I probably think they actually should go online because they're state funded, right? And so they can go online. They don't have to worry about keeping the doors open, right? Harvard, go to the other extreme. Harvard's this way. Harvard's going to be able to keep their doors open, right? Because if they go online, right, if there's students that say, well, if you're going to go online, I'm just going to wait a year until all this is over, and I'll just take a year off and do something else or whatever. There are a billion other people that are okay. I'll take their spot at Harvard, right? Like Harvard's not going to have any problems with enrollment, right? Where the problem lays is in colleges like mine that are tuition driven, right? That, we don't have a giant waiting list, right? And if we say for safety, we have to go online, right? There's a good chance that a lot of students will say, well, then I'm just going to wait a year, right? But if they wait a year, that means our enrollment goes down. We have no tuition. We have no income. We can't pay anybody. Doors close, right? Yeah. And this could happen. And I'm not trying to speak specifically about my college. Every college is unique and the conditions are different. I don't know what would happen to my college if we went all online. I honestly don't know, right? But I know that I'm very confident that for a lot of colleges, if they had to go online, they would close because their student enrollment would just drop off the map. Right. And you'd like to encourage the students like, no, be a team player. And, if you do this, we're going to close doors. You're not going to have a college to come back to. Right. But students are going to act what's in their individual interest. And I can, from an individual point of view, I can understand, well, I want to be in class, so I'll just wait a year. Right. But if too many people do that, there will be no college in a year. Right. And so this could have a monumentally negative effect on higher education. Right. You could have a lot of unemployed professors, a lot of colleges close, a lot of people not able to get a college education, that kind of stuff. And if you think about how a lack of higher education is a large part of what got us into this damn mess in the first place, we end up in a feedback loop.
Sure. Right.
Like bad education leads to pandemic leads to even less education, which leads to even worse outcome. And it's terrifying, right? What needs to happen, what won't happen, but what needs to happen is that there needs to be a bailout of higher education in the same way that we bailed out the auto industry and in the same way that we bailed out the farmers whenever the agricultural tanked because of the trade war and blah, 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 right? Like same thing needs to happen here. There needs to be money made available. So if schools have to go all online and thus lose a whole bunch of tuition dollars, there's government aid there to keep the doors open until the vaccine is around, and then we can open doors back up and we can go, right? I mean, make them pay it back. I don't care, right? But give them that opportunity to kind of weather the storm, because if we don't have that, a lot of them could close, and it could be really, really bad.
Wow. It's hard to believe we're coming down to an hour of talking about masks and economics and schools. And the last question I like to ask my guests, is there something you wanted me to ask you about, but we didn't get to? And this isn't about plugs or where people can find you online, but was there a topic you wanted to touch on that we just didn't get to?
I don't think so, because we talked about kind of both angles of the pseudoscience. We talked about how masks aren't dangerous, the hypocrisy of that. We talked about the schools and that kind of stuff. We talked about the misrepresenting the studies, and like the studies aren't about what you say they are about, or you're looking at the one line and ignoring all the stuff that says the study is weak and that kind of stuff. Maybe the only other thing to say, well, the other kind of bit of pseudoscience that we haven't talked about is the conspiracy theories, right?
Yeah.
And I'll just, because we're running out of time, I'll just leave with this. One of the things that's been understood about conspiracy theories for a long time is what motivates them is something called, and I saw another name for this the other day that was even better. It's motivated by something called the representative heuristic. It's the like causes like fallacy, that like effects have like causes, okay? So the Jfk assassination, of course, there's giant conspiracy theories about that, right? Because it was a giant, huge event, right? There are no conspiracy theories about the attempted Reagan assassination.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Basically, the same thing happened. Somebody took a shot at the president, right? But the result was different. In one, he died. The other, he didn't, right? And their studies have actually shown, like, if you show people articles and the news about like someone being assassinated, and the news story is exactly the same, except for the person died or they were wounded or they were perfectly fine. If they died, people are much more likely to invoke a conspiracy theory. If they were wounded, not so much. If they weren't injured at all, not at all, right? Mm-hmm. But literally, the only difference between those stories is the guns here versus here versus here.
Yeah.
Right. That's the only thing that, like, and you need a giant government conspiracy to explain why the gun was here and he hit him rather than here and he missed him. Like, no, right? what motivates conspiracy theories, the idea is if there's a big event, it can't have a simple cause. Yeah. It must have a giant, there must be giant world organizations all making it blah, 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 right? And so the bigger the event, the bigger conspiracy must be behind it, right? Presidential assassination that fails. Oh yeah, that was just a crazy guy, right? It's the same thing going on here. It's not surprising that there are a billion conspiracy theories about the pandemic because it is a worldwide phenomenon. Nothing this big worldwide has happened. 9/11 and the Kennedy assassination and the moon landing and that kind of stuff, they're not nearly as big. They weren't worldwide events. They were big events, right? But they weren't the whole damn world's in lockdown. Everyone's in, this is a huge, huge event. And so because it is such a huge, huge event, it is psychologically natural for people to want to look for a big, huge cause, right? But that does not follow. Big events can have simple causes, right? One virus breaking out in one place from one animal in one meat market, whatever, and that's all it takes. And then it, like in the same way that a fire can have a very simple cause, just a single match, right?
Yeah.
That's all. But it's not surprising that there's all these conspiracy theories because this is the kind of thing that people are, it's irrational, but are psychologically apt to invent conspiracies for.
Sure. Well, this has been a great conversation. I learned a lot of things. Dr. David Kyle Johnson, where can people find you online, sir?
You can find me on Facebook at Dr. David Kyle Johnson. That's Dr. David Kyle Johnson, I believe. Just just search it. I'm Kyle8425 on Twitter, but I don't use Twitter all that much. Look for my great courses on the great courses, Exploring Metaphysics, Big Questions of Philosophy, and Sci-Fi, Science Fiction as Philosophy. It's right here. It's lots of fun. Sci-fi is lots and lots of fun. My blog on Psychology Today. And I will send you some links that you can put.
Please do.
Underneath that have some of my papers that I've written that debunk some of the pseudoscience, that gives a simple explanation for how masks work and how we know they work. If you want something for your classes to show your students about why we wear masks, I've got that. I'll put those there for you. Then kind of just look down below.
That'd be fantastic. Thanks for everyone in the chat. It's been great seeing you, communicating with you, chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Andy. It was great.
This has been a lot of fun.
Great. I'm glad.
Take care, everyone.